At 52, 4 days after she signed the divorce papers and 3 weeks after the bank called about the second missed mortgage payment, Sylvia Crane sat on the floor of her soon-to-be former kitchen with a cardboard box in her lap and a cashier's check for $11,000, her half of a joint account that had once held 6 times that, and a small brass key she had never seen before in her life. The key had been inside a mason jar. The mason jar had been inside a shoebox. The shoebox had been on the top shelf of the hall closet behind a stack of Gordon's flannel shirts. She'd been meaning to donate for 2 years and kept not donating, and when she finally took them down to put them in the box for goodwill, the shoebox came with them and landed on the floor, and the mason jar rolled out and the key slid against the glass with a sound like a small bell. Once, and then went still. Gordon Crane had lived in that house for 19 years. Sylvia had lived in it for 17 of them, and she had never once seen that key, never once heard him mention a mason jar. And she would have said, if you had asked her 3 weeks ago, that she knew every corner of that house the way you know a place you've given your best years to. She would have been wrong about that. She was wrong about a lot of things, as it turned out. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find you right when you need them, take a second and subscribe to Grand Stories, and drop us a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now let me tell you about Sylvia. Sylvia Crane had been married to Gordon for 17 years, and for the last 4 of them she had known, in the way that women know things they don't say out loud, that the marriage was a house with a slow leak somewhere in the walls. She could hear it, she couldn't find it. She kept painting over the watermarks and telling herself it was fine, telling herself that quiet men had quiet marriages, and that was just the way it was. Gordon worked for the county roads department, had since before she knew him. He drove a grader, mostly, out on the rural routes west of Calverton, and he was the kind of man who came home with red clay on his boots and ate whatever she put in front of him and never asked what she'd done with her day, in a way that made her think he was actually curious. He wasn't mean, he wasn't loud, he was just elsewhere. Present in body, absent in whatever the other thing is, the thing you actually marry a person for. They had met at a church potluck in 2006 when Sylvia was 35 and working as a bookkeeper for a small trucking company and telling herself she was still young enough that it could all change. Gordon had come in late with a dish covered in foil that turned out to be a sweet potato casserole he'd made himself, and that had surprised her enough that she'd asked him about it. And he'd gone slightly pink and said his mother had taught him, and he liked to cook when he had the time. And she had thought, here is a man with some gentleness in him. She was not wrong about that. She was just wrong about how far it extended, and toward whom. She had one daughter from a previous relationship, a girl named Becca, who was 9 when Sylvia and Gordon married, and who had called him Gordon her whole life, never Dad, which Gordon said didn't bother him and maybe didn't. Becca was in Atlanta now, 30 years old, with a baby of her own and a husband Sylvia liked fine, and when Sylvia had called her to say the divorce was finalized, Becca had said, "Mom, I know this is hard, but I think you already know it's right." And Sylvia had said yes and meant it, and then sat on the kitchen floor anyway because knowing something is right doesn't make the floor feel less cold under you. The divorce hadn't come from a single event. It never does, the real ones. It had come from 900 small evenings of reaching across a distance that never got smaller. And a Tuesday in February, when Sylvia had sat across from Gordon at the supper table and realized she couldn't remember the last time he'd asked her a question. Not a real one. Not one where he leaned forward waiting to hear the answer. She tried to say this to him, calmly, not as an accusation. He'd looked at her for a long moment and said, "I don't know what you want from me, Sylvia." And she had thought, "I know, that's the problem." She filed in March. Gordon did not contest it. He moved into a rental on the other side of Calverton, took his tools and his truck and the recliner, and left the rest, including, apparently, a shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet. The key was small and flat, the kind that opens a padlock rather than a door. Old-looking, the brass worn soft at the edges from being handled. There was a piece of masking tape on it with 4 letters written in Gordon's handwriting, blocky and careful, the way he wrote everything. Like each letter was a small effort he was making. The tape said shed. That was all. Just shed. Sylvia sat on the kitchen floor and looked at that word for a long time. They didn't have a shed on this property. There was a detached garage, and she'd always called it the garage. Gordon had always called it the garage. If he had wanted a key to the garage, it would have been on the ring with the house key and the truck key, Not inside a mason jar, inside a shoebox, behind shirts nobody wore anymore. She called Becca that evening. Not about the key right away, she called the way she always did lately, just to hear a voice that knew her. They talked about the baby, about Atlanta, about whether Sylvia should take the bookkeeping job she'd been offered at the hardware store downtown. And then, in a pause, Sylvia said, "I found a key today, in the closet." On a piece of tape Gordon had written shed on it. "We don't have a shed." Becca was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Huh," and Sylvia said, "Yeah, are you going to find out what it opens?" "I don't know." But she knew. She'd already known since the floor. That was why she hadn't thrown it away. The next morning she drove out to Gordon's rental. She had called ahead, which felt strange, calling ahead to visit a man she'd been married to for 17 years. But it was his house now, and she supposed that's what you did. He came to the door in his work clothes, already dressed for a shift, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her lately, cautious and a little sorry, like a man waiting for a weather report he already knew would be bad. She held up the key. He looked at it a long time. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before, or hadn't noticed, which she was starting to understand were not always the same thing. "Where'd you find that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "The closet, top shelf, inside a mason jar, inside a shoebox." He let out a long breath through his nose. He looked past her at the street for a moment, at nothing specific, and then he looked back. "It opens a shed," he said. "Out on Old Prentice Road. About 8 miles past the county line. Your shed?" "Mine, I bought it. The land about 6 years ago, little under an acre." She waited. "I should have told you," he said. "I know that, I just—" He stopped. Tried again. "I didn't know how to explain it without explaining everything else, and I didn't know how to do that either." Sylvia looked at him. In 17 years, Gordon Crane had never said the words "I didn't know how to" more than a handful of times. He was a man who knew how to do most things with his hands and very few things with his mouth, and she had long since stopped expecting speeches from him. This was somehow more words than usual, which meant the something else was large. "What does everything else mean, Gordon?" He worked his jaw. "Go out there," he said. "Take the key. The address is on the paper in the jar if you still have it." There was no paper, might fallen out. "It's 4412 Prentice Road. You'll see the turnoff." He paused. "There's a woman named Dolores Fitch who has a place about a quarter-mile north. She looks after things when I'm not there. She knows who you are. She'll help you if you need it." "Gordon, please," he said, quiet. "Just go see it, then call me if you want. Or don't. I think you should see it yourself first. If you've stayed with us this far, we want to say, what Sylvia found on Prentice Road is exactly what we've been building toward. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next on Grandsome Stories." She drove out on a Saturday morning in November when the sky was low and white, and the fields along the highway had gone the color of straw. Prentice Road turned to gravel after the third crossroads, and the gravel was the kind that pinged up against the undercarriage of her car and made her slow down to 10 miles an hour. She passed 2 farmhouses and a rusted mailbox with no name on it, and then she saw the turnoff, a break in the fence line with a dirt track worn just wide enough for a vehicle, and at the end of it, a shed. It was larger than she'd expected. Real construction, not a kit. Wood-sided tin roof, a double door in front with a hasp and padlock, a small window on the south side. Behind it, a kitchen garden gone to seed for winter, the cages still standing over the tomato beds. Off to the left, a long, low structure she didn't recognize at first and then did, a rabbit hutch, 8 or 10 sections, empty now but built solid with care. She unlocked the padlock with the brass key and pushed the doors open. Inside, clean. That was the first thing. Clean and organized in the way of a person who has a system, who knows where everything is and puts it back. Along one wall, shelving built from 2x4s, lined with mason jars, and here her breath caught because she recognized the jars, the same kind as the one with the key, and these were full of seeds. Dozens of them, labeled in Gordon's printing. Cherokee Purple, Mortgage Lifter, Dragon Tongue, Moon and Stars. The names of heirloom varieties she'd heard somewhere once and never thought about again. Along the other wall, a workbench with tools she didn't recognize, specialized things. Soil blockers and seeding trays and small copper markers on a ring. A notebook open to a page of records, planting dates, germination rates, notes in his careful hand. Scarlet Runner, slower than last year, check drainage, and Trout gave cutting of the brandywine her grandmother brought from Germany, plant in partial shade. On the back wall, a corkboard covered in photographs. Not family photos, not vacation photos. Gardens. Dozens of them, different yards, different seasons. Some lush with summer and some in early spring, bare road and promising, and in the corner of almost every photograph, barely visible, a small cardboard marker with a variety name she recognized from the shelves. He had been giving them away. She stood in the middle of that shed and turned around very slowly. And what she understood standing there was that this was not a hiding place for something shameful. This was a hiding place for something that mattered more to Gordon Crane than he had ever found the words to say. She drove to the quarter-mile north farmhouse and knocked. The woman who answered was in her 70s, lean and weathered, with a long braid over one shoulder and soil under her fingernails even in November. She looked at Sylvia and said, "You must be his wife." "I was," Sylvia said. "I'm Sylvia Dolores." She opened the door wider. "Come in, I'll put the kettle on." This is a longer conversation than a doorstep. Dolores Fitch had known Gordon for 5 years, since he'd shown up at her gate one spring evening with a flat of tomato starts he'd grown from seed and no explanation beyond, "A neighbor said you grow things and I've got more than I can use." She'd been skeptical. She wasn't a woman who took to strangers easily, but she'd taken the tomatoes because you didn't refuse tomato starts. And by midsummer she'd understood that Gordon Crane was not a stranger in the usual sense. He was the kind of man who showed up with what you needed before you knew you needed it and never made you feel the weight of it. He came out here every Saturday, Dolores said, and every other Wednesday in growing season. Worked the garden, tended the hutch. He raised rabbits for about 2 years, gave the meat to families from the food pantry at Calverton Methodist, never told the pantry who it came from. They just found it in the donation cooler. Thea set down her teacup. "The seeds," Dolores went on. "That's the main thing. He's been collecting and growing out heirloom varieties for 6 years. Things people's grandmothers grew that you can't buy at the farm store anymore. He gives them away. Started with neighbors, then the community garden over in Whitfield County, then a woman at the extension office got wind of it, and now he supplies starter seeds for about 11 family gardens every spring, most of them low-income families with kids." She paused. He never wanted any fuss about it. Wasn't looking for recognition. He liked growing things, and he couldn't stand the idea of a seed variety dying out because nobody thought to save it. "How many families?" Sylvia said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd meant. Dolores thought about it. "Directly, maybe 40 over the years. But the seeds get passed on. That's the nature of them. If I had to guess what's been grown from what came out of that shed, I couldn't count it." Sylvia sat with that for a moment. 40 families. Every Saturday for 6 years, rabbits in a donation cooler. Seeds going back to a woman's grandmother in another country. And he had driven home from all of it and sat in the recliner and said when she tried to tell him about her day. She understood now that the two things were not separate. The man who couldn't speak, and the man who built something beautiful in silence. That was not a contradiction. It was the same person, expressing the only way he knew how to express, and the tragedy of it was not that he was a bad man. The tragedy was that he had no more idea how to bring what was in that shed into their living room than he knew how to fly. "He talked about you," Dolores said, like she had read the shape of Sylvia's silence. "Not often. But when he did, he talked about you like a man who knew he was failing at something important and didn't know how to stop." "Then why didn't he?" "I asked him once," Dolores said. "Sat right where you are, about 2 years back. He looked at the floor for so long I thought he'd forgotten the question. Then he said, if I show her this, she's going to ask me why I never told her about it. And the true answer is, I don't know why. And I can't stand to look her in the face and say I don't know why." Dolores turned her cup in her hands. "He wasn't protecting a secret. He was protecting you from the answer to a question he couldn't answer." Sylvia drove back to Calverton and sat in her car outside the house that wasn't quite hers anymore and looked at the brass key in her palm. 40 families, 11 community gardens. Heirloom seeds that had belonged to someone's grandmother, saved from disappearing. A man who raised rabbits on his day off and put the meat in a cooler at a church pantry before sunrise so no one would know. And every Saturday she had assumed, in the vague and curious way of a tired marriage, that he was doing something with his time. She had never once asked what. She had filled the silence between them with her own interpretation of it. She had decided what the silence meant and stopped listening for what might be inside it. That evening she called Gordon. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I went," she said. A long pause. "Okay, Dolores told me." "Okay, Gordon, why?" She stopped. She had the question and she couldn't make it come out right, couldn't shape it into something that wasn't an accusation, even though that wasn't how she meant it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, slowly, like a man choosing each word from a short list, "I always thought I'd get better at explaining myself. I thought I had more time. That was all." But it was the most honest thing he had said to her in 17 years, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Now, before we tell you what happened next, we need to say this. What came after was not a reconciliation story. Some of you may be hoping for that, and we understand why. But the truth is more complicated and we think more useful than that. Stay with us. The divorce was already finalized. That didn't change. What changed was smaller and maybe more durable. Sylvia stopped carrying a verdict. She had decided, somewhere in the last 4 years, that Gordon's silence was evidence of absence, that a man who said so little must have so little. She had built a case against him the way people build cases against the quiet ones, by filling in all the blanks themselves with the worst available interpretation. And the shoebox in the closet with the brass key inside had taken that case apart. He wasn't empty. He was full of something she hadn't thought to look for. The question was what to do with that now. She went back to Prentice Road the following weekend. She wasn't sure why, exactly. She told herself she was curious about the garden records, about the seeds, about the 11 community gardens and what happened to them in spring if Gordon was. What, exactly? Busy? Moved on? She didn't finish the thought. Dolores was outside splitting wood when Sylvia pulled up, and she set down the maul and said, "Thought you might come back." They walked the property together. Dolores showed her the cold frames Gordon had built against the south wall of the shed, where the lettuces and kale would overwinter under glass. She showed her the seed inventory in the notebook, variety, year collected, source, germination rate, and explained that this represented 6 years of Gordon's Saturdays, patient and methodical, every plant grown out and harvested for seed, and dried and labeled before the next season started. Most of this would die if nobody tended it, Dolores said. She wasn't looking at Sylvia when she said it. She was looking at the cold frames. The seeds keep fine. But the growing out, the selection, the passing on, that takes somebody who knows what they're doing and will show up consistently. Sylvia understood what she wasn't saying. "I don't know anything about seeds," Sylvia said. "No," Dolores agreed. "But you're a bookkeeper. And this," she gestured at the notebook, "is a mess of records that's been kept by a man who's better with plants than paper. If you could make sense of that inventory, get it organized digitally, cross-reference it against the Extension Office catalog." She stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to recruit you. You're a little bit trying to recruit me," Sylvia said. Dolores looked at her and for the first time she smiled. "A little bit," she admitted. The woman at the county extension office was named Priscilla Okafor, and she had been receiving Gordon Crane's seed donations for 3 years without knowing his last name, or where he lived, or how to reach him. He had always left them with a note. Variety name, germination date, any special growing notes, and no return contact. She had started asking around about him the previous spring, after the Moon and Stars watermelon seeds he'd sent had produced better plants than anything in the catalog, and nobody at the extension office could tell her where they'd come from. When Sylvia walked into Priscilla's office at the extension building on a Tuesday in December and introduced herself, Priscilla went very still for a moment, in the way of a person who is resisting the impulse to say something that might sound unprofessional. Then she said, "Do you know how long we've been trying to find that man?" She pulled up a spreadsheet. In 3 years, Gordon's seeds had gone into 11 family garden plots directly, and through the Extension Office's distribution program, into an additional 23. Priscilla could track germination success rates, yield comparisons, variety preservation value. She had been writing a small grant application to try to formalize a county seed library, and the backbone of what she'd been hoping to build was, she turned the screen, exactly the inventory sitting in a notebook in a shed on Prentice Road. "He had no idea about the grant," Sylvia said. "He had no idea about any of this, he just kept dropping things off." Priscilla shook her head slowly. "I have a chart here. If I try to map the secondary and tertiary distribution from his original donations, people who save their own seeds and pass them on, the number of households who've grown something from his collection is probably over 200, and that's just the 3 years I can document." Sylvia sat down without being invited. Over 200, conservatively. Gordon Crane had driven out to a shed on an empty road every Saturday for 6 years, growing seeds from varieties that were disappearing. and the radius of what had grown from what he started was larger than either of them had known to imagine. He had built something quietly and without credit, and it had spread the way seeds spread, one person to the next, and it had never once required him to explain himself or be recognized or say anything out loud about what he was doing or why. He had grown a legacy in a language he understood. The tragedy was that Sylvia had never learned to speak it. Here is where the story turns, and we want you to stay with us for this part. 3 weeks after Sylvia's visit to the extension office, Priscilla Okafor's grant applications came back approved. $4,200 from a state agricultural preservation fund, enough to build a proper seed library in the back room of the Calverton Public Library, digitize the inventory, and hire a part-time coordinator for the first year. Priscilla called Sylvia the same afternoon. "I want to name it," Priscilla said. "The library, if Gordon would allow it." Sylvia said she'd ask. She drove to the rental on the other side of town. Gordon answered the door, looking like a man who'd been working in a garden, which she understood now he literally had been. He'd started a container setup on the back patio of the rental, couldn't help himself. She told him about Priscilla, about the grant, about the 200 households conservatively, growing from what he'd started. He stood in the doorway and listened, the way he always listened, without moving, without expression. And when she finished, he said nothing for long enough, that she started to wonder if she'd said something wrong. Then he said, just barely, 200, that's the low estimate. He looked at the middle distance. Huh. That was all, just that. But she'd known him long enough to know that in his particular language, that quiet huh was the equivalent of someone else going to pieces in a doorway. She told him about the name. About Priscilla wanting to call it something, wanting there to be a name attached, not anonymous anymore. He was quiet again then. She can call it whatever she likes. It's hers now more than mine, Gordon. He looked at her. You built something. She said it the way you say a thing that should have been said years earlier. You built something real, and it mattered, and I'm sorry I didn't know to look for it. He looked at the door frame. His jaw moved. For a terrible second she thought he might cry, which she had never seen him do, not once in 17 years, not at funerals, not at anything he didn't. He blinked once and set his face, and said, with the particular effort of a man laying something down, I should have shown you. I know that. I should have brought you out there years ago and just shown you. Yes, she said, you should have. There was nothing to add to that. They were both right, and they both knew it, and the marriage was still over, and the key was still in her pocket. And some things you can understand completely and still not be able to put back together. That is not a failure. That is just the shape of some lives. The Calverton Public Library hosted a small opening for the Seed Library in February, on a Thursday evening when it was cold enough that only the people who really meant it would come. Sylvia had expected a modest crowd. She had not expected the room to be full. They came the way people come when something has quietly meant a great deal to them, and they finally have a place to say so. A woman named Sandra, 71, who had been growing her grandmother's okra from a variety Gordon had sent her 2 years ago, and who had brought a quart jar of seeds to donate. A family, the mother and 3 kids, who had grown their first garden last summer from a starter packet from the extension office and were vibrating with the specific enthusiasm of people who have discovered that things grow from the ground if you let them. A man who ran a small restaurant and had been using dragon tongue beans on his menu for a year without knowing where they'd originally come from. Priscilla spoke first. She was precise and warm, and she said the things that needed to be said about preservation and community, and the particular importance of seeds that carry a family's history inside them. And then she introduced Gordon. Gordon Crane walked to the front of the room in a clean button shirt and stood at the small podium and looked out at the people and said nothing for long enough that someone in the back coughed. Then he said, I'm not good at this. A few people laughed warmly. The seeds are better at it than I am, he said. A seed doesn't need you to understand it. It just needs you to put it in the ground and not give up on it. He stopped. That's what I've got. He stepped back from the podium. Priscilla started clapping, and the room followed, and Gordon stood there looking slightly surprised by the whole situation, like a man who had expected to do this in private forever, and was only now adjusting to the alternative. Sylvia stood in the back of the room and watched him. She had spent 17 years thinking the lights were off inside him. What she was looking at now was not the lights coming on. They had always been on. She had just been looking for them in the wrong rooms. She stayed until the end, She helped stack chairs. On her way out, Gordon caught her in the doorway, not dramatically, just an ordinary catch, a hand briefly on her arm. "Thank you," he said, "for going out there." "You left the key where I'd find it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I didn't know if you'd look. I almost didn't." He nodded once. That was all. She went home. She took the bookkeeping job at the hardware store. In spring, she went back to Prentice Road on her own and helped Dolores get the cold frames ready. And then she went back the following Saturday and the one after that. She learned to read the notebook. She learned the difference between saving seeds from a pepper and saving them from a tomato, which is more complicated than it sounds. She made the inventory into a spreadsheet and sent a copy to Priscilla at the extension office, and Priscilla sent back a list of 40 varieties that regional seed banks considered at risk. And Sylvia brought that list out to Prentice Road and found that Gordon had already collected 11 of them. She didn't call and tell him. She added them to the database, labeled the jars with new dates, and put a note in the record. Preserved, she wrote, and the year. That summer, the first full summer, she tended the garden herself. She sat in the shed door on a Saturday afternoon in June with a glass of water and the notebook open in her lap. And she thought about a woman she'd been 3 years earlier, sitting on a kitchen floor with a cashier's check for $11,000 and a key she didn't recognize. The floor had felt very cold that day. The silence of the house had felt like proof of something she'd spent years suspecting, that she had chosen wrong, that she had given her best years to a man who had nothing to give back. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about a lot of things. She was not back with Gordon. She was not trying to be. What she was, instead, was the person who kept the records and showed up on Saturdays, and understood now what it meant to tend something, not because it would resolve anything, not because it would give her back the years, but because the seeds needed someone to put them in the ground and not give up on them. That, she had come to think, was enough. Maybe that was the whole point. The brass key lived in a small dish on her windowsill now, next to a clay pot with a Cherokee purple tomato seedling in it. First of the season, coming up out of soil she'd started herself, from seeds she'd saved herself, from a plant Gordon had grown 6 years ago, from something a woman named Mrs. Trout had carried here from somewhere else entirely. She watered it every morning. She didn't think about where it had come from. She thought about where it was going. Here is what that quiet man left behind, and here is what Sylvia Crane found when she went looking. A man is not the sum of what he says. Sometimes the people who go silent on you are not empty. They are full of something they have not yet found the language for. And the only way to know the difference is to stay curious long enough to find the key. Sylvia had found hers on the floor of a closet 4 days after a divorce, and she had done the harder thing, which was to go see what it opened, even when she had every reason not to. It is not too late to look. Whatever door you've been standing outside of, whatever silence you've already decided to interpret, it is not too late to try the handle. You might find exactly what you expected. Or you might find a shed full of seeds that have been quietly growing into something that will outlast everything you thought you knew about the person who put them there. Keep going. Keep the door open. Some things can only grow in the looking.